Okay, good morning. You are here with Jennifer Grenke and Milaney Leverson. We are both technical assistance coordinators for PBIS with the Wisconsin RTI Center. And we're here today to talk about equitable practices for preventing and responding to problem behavior. So what we know is that our systems, our PBIS systems and our discipline systems work very well for some kids, and they don't always work as well for other kids because we set up systems that reflect us as educators. So we want to be sure that those systems also reflect our students and make some room for what they're learning at home and what they bring with them from home. So some things to think about. When we look at referrals, we can see these are office discipline referrals, majors from 2007, 2008. So as you can see here, this is a slide that I believe is pulled directly from Swiss just as an example. But what this shows us and what this example is of looking for patterns in the data. So what we can find when we look at patterns in the data is we see spikes at certain times of the year in our office discipline referrals. And we really believe that those spikes are due to certain factors within our schools. So basically, if you look at this, you can see that some of these spikes happen around or within months that have breaks in them. So when we are coming up to Thanksgiving, when we're coming up to that winter break, sometimes around spring break, or if kids are getting really antsy in the spring, we tend to notice that either school staff are starting to have factors that contribute to their maybe their lack of patience, or our kids are getting rowdier because they're a little bit anxious to get out of the building and get home and do fun things, or a combination of the two. And what we know about cultural identity is that our schools have a particular cultural identity, which may be slightly different from that of the community because it's made up of the educators and the students specifically. There isn't always a ton of family voice in our schools. What we would like is for our school's cultural identity to also reflect our students' cultural identity and our community's cultural identity. When that doesn't happen, we see this cultural stress. So our students are feeling like they're expected to change certain things about their behavior or some things about just who they are, feel like they don't fit within our school system. When we are able to make this, our school's cultural identity, reflective of our students' identities, that's cultural responsiveness. So it's really getting to know our students, getting to know their families, getting to know their communities, and having that reflected in our school systems. That's what cultural responsiveness really is. So when we think about discipline, we need to think about things like institutional language, our rules and expectations, our achievement goals, and our administrative structures, and whether or not those things reflect what we see for students and their families. Does the individual language of students and their families match the language that we're using at school? Or are we making a bridge for those two different languages if they're different? What do our rules and expectations look like in comparison to those rules and expectations of our students and their families? And if there's a mismatch there, how do we help students understand that mismatch? We don't want to use cultural responsiveness as an excuse to allow bad behavior, but we do want to start thinking about our definition of bad behavior, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and what the norms are that those definitions are based on. The other thing we know, like I mentioned earlier, is that when we're making decisions in schools, resource depletion can impact the decisions that we make as educators. So what we see here is that these kids are pretty wild. They're standing on desks. The student's asking why. The expectation is to show respect, and the teacher looks really frustrated, and she says, "Because I say so," which, if any of you are parents or have kids in your life outside of school, it's probably something you said. I know that I have. But what this comic or this joke is really a sign of is the fact that sometimes as humans, as human educators in schools, there are times where we're tired, where we're hungry, where we've had a really bad day before we even got to work. And that impacts our decision making and our interactions with students. And what we're trying to get at through this presentation and through this conversation is not that we need to stop that impact, but that we need to acknowledge that that happens. We need to acknowledge that we're human and that there are situations in which we might not be prepared to make the best decision or to decide the best consequence. And that's where we need to kind of make some room for some other thing to happen, essentially. So one of the ways to do this is this two-step neutralizing routine for staff. So this is when we're looking at these vulnerable decision points, like if you know that you're hungry, if you know that you're tired, if you've been on a field trip on a Monday and now it's Tuesday and you're just exhausted and kind of sick of misbehavior or sick of things like that, that's where we want staff to start to recognize, okay, this might not be a moment for me to make the best decision. So I need to take a step back. I need to maybe stop and think, and then I need to proceed from there. So what we're really talking about with this two-step neutralizing routine is, one, identifying that vulnerable decision point, and two, following a set procedure for how to deal with that vulnerable decision point. And a vulnerable decision point is when we think a situation is impacted by implicit bias or impacted by environmental factors, again, like how we're feeling as adults or what we're going through as adults. And when these two things combine, the situation and the implicit bias, it really makes for a perfect setup for disproportionate discipline. Because we're more likely, if we're distracted or frustrated or hungry or tired, we're more likely to fall back on what we were raised as, or what we were raised as knowing to be appropriate versus inappropriate, rather than our school systems and what they have defined. So some vulnerable decision points that I've already mentioned, most of them. Subjective behavior is a big one. Disrespect, disruption, those are behaviors that are really hard to define, and they're really hard to define consistently across people and across settings. So that's a typical vulnerable decision point, because it's easy for me to say, boy, that was really disrespectful, and want to give a student a consequence, when Jennifer, who is going to present in a second, might say, boy, I really didn't think so. I interpreted that completely differently. So that's one example of a really specific vulnerable decision point. Some others that I've mentioned, hunger, if it's right before lunch and you know that you have to make copies through the whole lunch hour, you could be in a place where you might not make the best decision, or the discipline that you would be administering might not quite fit the actual behavior. A vague discipline system, so where expectations aren't clear, where the system that our PBIS teams have set up really just isn't clear or straightforward enough for staff to follow, where they're having to make decisions without support, essentially. Fatigue, I mentioned, and then common areas, or being unfamiliar with the student. So I was a former school psychologist, or I was a school psychologist, and in that role, I didn't always know all the kids in the building. So it made it somewhat difficult to interact with some of the students and understand where their behavior was coming from. If, for example, a student who was joking around with a staff member was really being disrespectful, or if that relationship is existing and that behavior is expected and okay. So another way to think about this is really in this, this ABC, or this functional behavioral assessment type of pattern. So I'm going to walk you through a typical process that might happen, and then I'll add in some pieces that'll help explain this neutralizing routine, I think, a little bit more specifically. So this is specifically for reducing effects of implicit bias. What we might see as a setting event is a lack of positive interactions with the student, or fatigue. So this is for the school staff person. The antecedent to this, the situation would be loud complaints about work. So the student starts complaining about work. This is subjective, disrespectful behavior. Some people might find it disrespectful, some people might not. And depending on the level of complaint, again, it's a very subjective definition. So if a student's complaining about work, the staff member is tired and they haven't had a lot of positive interactions with the student, a typical adult behavior, or one of the adult behaviors that we might see, is that student would then receive an ODR. The staff would send the student to the office. The consequence of this process working this way is that the student ends up leaving class. So they're doing, what's happening there is a couple of things. This student then is escaping that social interaction with the adult that they don't have a positive relationship with to begin with, which we know from that setting event. They're also escaping the task, this work right here, most likely, and they're headed to the office where sometimes there's some really unintentional positive benefit of going to the office where students, even if they're in trouble, they're getting some interaction that they wouldn't normally get, and it's fairly individualized. So we want to be really careful about this, sending students out of class. The other thing we want to do is kind of stop this process and circumvent it between this antecedent and the adult behavior. So what we want to have happen is we want to train our staff members, and we want our teams to set up systems in which we can have a setting event like this. So again, acknowledging that sometimes we're just not going to be perfect as adults. We're human. We need to work with where we are in the moment. So thinking about that, having this behavior occur, then we want our staff to be able to stop and think, is this a vulnerable decision point? And that's something that you can help them identify. So in most cases, what we want to have happen with these systems is we want your team to start looking at your data and identifying those vulnerable decision points. If we know that before lunch is always a place where we tend to give a lot of office discipline referrals and we tend to give them out disproportionately, then that's probably a decision point that we want to target with our staff. So we want our staff to do some self-assessment, and that will take some teaching. We need to teach them to think about that, ask that question. Next, if it is a vulnerable decision point, we want to teach our staff to use an alternative response. So instead of sending the student to the office with an ODR and having them leave class, we want to stop that. We want to change that process and use an alternative response that the staff can agree on. So in this case, it's see me after class. And obviously that's assuming that this behavior isn't disrupting the entire classroom, isn't disrupting all the learning of the other students. But really, if it's not, we should be able to teach our staff and help our staff systemically use this process of thinking about, is this a vulnerable decision point? And if so, what are some alternative responses that I can use? That will, again, circumvent this process from happening and hopefully get us away from some of that disproportionate discipline that we're seeing patterns of in the data. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she's going to follow up with some more details about this process. Jen, are you there?
I am. I'm just getting to the...
All right.
So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail, like Milaney said, and talk about what makes for good neutralizing routines or alternative responses. So thinking about those vulnerable decision points that were just mentioned, knowing that when we as staff are in those moments, that we need to act in line with what our school's values and expectations are, and we need to have a balance. So that's where we have that balance weight graphic on the screen so that you can see what we're really getting at is, as a team, the school needs to make a standard plan so that staff have a brief if-then statements that they know that they can use, that these are clear steps and they're doable for everyone in the building. Like Milaney mentioned, it needs to be systemic, so you need to train the staff to understand and be cognizant of where they're at in the moment. So thinking about this, when looking at your data, you could develop a standard plan using alternative responses. So here's a few examples. So one could be see me after class, just to delay that response and not overreact in the moment. And this gives the staff a chance to think through and process the situation again and then act accordingly. What we want is to keep those kids in the classroom, and sometimes the easiest thing to do is get them out, but that's maybe not the best for that student. Also thinking again, we could use a pause. So this is very similar to the delay, but giving the staff a chance to think through the whole situation before sending that student out of the class or overreacting to their behavior. And what we want is to be least exclusionary and keeping those kids in that learning environment. So we could speak to the student privately, you know, stating the confidence that you have in them and that asking what their needs are, but doing this all privately so that it doesn't call that student out. Because many times what happens is we almost fuel the situation then if we do call them out in front of their peers. So what this all really boils down to is being aware of our own state, where we're at in the moment, and also knowing how are we feeling, like are we exhausted, are we hungry, do I have a headache, you know, is this all going to affect how I respond to these students? And just being able to have a response right at our fingertips so that we know this is what we're going to do so that we don't overreact, send that student out, but keep them in the classroom. I just wanted to share during a presentation with a DPI consultant who works on the Special Ed Complaint Investigation Department, it was stated that power struggles are the least effective way to decrease behavior and to be proactive and plan for the unexpected. And I bring this up because power struggles usually occur when we're frustrated and tired. So we need to be cognizant of that when going into those decisions that we're making and trying to plan for the unexpected and have that process already set up. So we look at this two-step neutralizing routine and how we can train our staff. And the first one is thinking, is this a vulnerable decision point? Am I in a state of mind that I can react to this appropriately, or am I hungry or tired? And if so, then I need to use that agreed upon response that we've decided. So those vulnerable decision points, such as a student talking out in class while the teacher's talking, we need to be prepared for this and think about what's been going on. Think if there's been a current event in the news and we know that the kids are going to want to talk about this issue, but we also have curriculum that we need to get through. Being proactive and telling the kids, you know, I know this is a big thing going on right now, but let's hold that conversation off, and I will give you a few minutes at the end of today to talk about this. But just being proactive is going to help decrease those vulnerable decision points and those times that the kids bring things up that you might react to. Also, thinking about all of this, that's like pre-correcting the students and thinking about what can I do to set this up so this is going to be a positive for the class as well as for this whole situation, and always being mindful again of where we are at. And this isn't just for our staff, but also for administrators. So you look at this picture and think, well, that's a pretty odd picture, but thinking about this is a situation where you need to freeze, as well as administrators. And it's going to be very uncomfortable because I think it's human nature to kind of react to behaviors that happen in class. But what we want is to freeze and think about the whole situation and deal with the behaviors accordingly so that when we handle the problem, we can stop and think about what is it that we need to do to act in line with our values. We need to get that information from the student and the staff. We need to build the student and teacher relationship or the administrator and student relationship. And whenever possible, we want to use those agreed upon responses to teach the missing skills that the student has, to be planful and proactive, and then always trying to keep that student in the learning environment if at all possible. So we're familiar with the restorative practices. Well, this is all about questioning, like, tell me what happened. What were you thinking? You know, what do you think about it now? Who did this affect? You know, you can ask all these questions to the student, as well as you can kind of question yourself if you're in that pause phase or that freeze phase of that neutralizing routine. And we use this two-step response because we want to be sure that we have all the facts and we have the data to be able to move forward and appropriately teach the student the appropriate response or behaviors that they should have in that situation. And all the time, what we want to do is validate, affirm, and build and bridge. So as Milaney had brought up, there could be some implicit bias as well as how we react. And we want to be able to think about that as well when we're developing those two-step routines and those responses of own implicit bias to things. An example, if you have a kindergarten student that consistently uses profanity, we can talk with the student to tell them, here at school we need to make sure everyone feels safe, and sometimes some of the words that are used make others feel unsafe. So here at school we can't use these words or those words, maybe just use, but then validate to that student. But sometimes our use, and that's okay. But here at school we want everyone to feel safe, and what we need is for you not to use those types of words here. And even at kindergarten, those kids get that because they want to feel safe as well. So most of us are familiar with the restorative practices. And thinking about those two-step routines that we've helped you develop or that you're going to develop with your staff, and thinking about, where am I currently? Am I in a vulnerable decision point? And if so, I need to delay my response to be able to respond appropriately. And in order to respond appropriately, we need to have a few questions we can ask to get at that antecedent or the trigger to the behavior that's occurred. So a few examples of questions may be, tell me what happened. What were you thinking? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? What can I do to help you to build the skill to respond appropriately in the class? Or we could have those delayed responses that we have. So, see me after class, or see me after school. I'm really disappointed. Can we talk about this later? So we need to have those responses all pre-planned so that we can respond appropriately. And we use this two-step response, or those neutralizing routines, because we want to be sure that we have all of the facts. And the facts are the data. And that data is what gets at that antecedent of, why did the student behave the way they did? Or why did they respond the way they did? And what can I do to help them? Because every time that we have a consequence, we need to teach. If that's a teachable moment, or if that's something we need to teach and give the student time to practice, but it's always a chance to teach them the appropriate behavior that we want. And then we need to validate and affirm that in certain situations, behaviors are okay, and in others they're not. And that's where we build and bridge, so we help them to develop the appropriate behavior. So an example might be that a student that is using profanity, and we can talk to the student about, here at school everyone needs to feel safe, and some of the words that you're using make others feel unsafe. So we can't continue to do that. So what we'd like you to do is use these words or use this behavior, but we need to teach them an alternative behavior so that others feel safe in the situation, as well as that we're building that situation appropriateness for that student. So we're affirming and validating that what they're saying may be what they need to do to gain the respect in a certain situation. But here at school, and that's the building and bridging part, we teach them alternative responses so that everyone feels safe here in our building, and that you understand that in certain situations there's different behaviors. And in order to make this all work, this can't just be one teacher doing this work, it needs to be systemic. So we need to provide that support for all the staff members that are doing this work. And so we need to provide that professional development. So first, help them, the staff, to use data to identify the extent of the problem. So in March, if we see there's a lot of office referrals coming in for disrespect or defiance, we need to think about that and think, we haven't had a break since January. The staff are frustrated, the kids are frustrated, they're anxious, it's cold, they haven't been outside. Could this be a vulnerable decision point school-wide? And if it is, we need to start looking at some of those vulnerable decision points and making sure the staff have those neutralizing routines down and that it becomes just automatic for their responses. So we need to teach that to them. We need to teach those vulnerable decision points and how to recognize them within ourselves, and then also to know our own biases, so that when we react to students, that we can react appropriately to help them gain the skills they need for the next time in another situation to act appropriately. So that's those neutralizing routines that we have that two-step. We set it up that, am I in a VDP, a vulnerable decision point? And if so, this is my response. And then finally, we need to always follow up. So with our staff, that ongoing coaching and progress monitoring to look at the data to see, are we doing what we said we wanted to do? And then finally, I wanted to point out on our website, under the Classroom Management for Academic Engagement module, there is this training supplement with implicit bias materials that you have access to, and we encourage you to go in and dig a little deeper to find out a little more about implicit bias, as well as at each CISA, except CISAs 5, 6, and 12, you can connect with a classroom management trainer that can do professional development for your school or for your district. And if you want, they can specifically target that implicit bias. And you are also welcome to connect with any of our technical assistance coordinators for the Wisconsin PBIS network, as well as feel free to connect with Milaney or myself. We thank you for being here today and encourage you to develop those two-step neutralizing routines with your staff.